Students, you have reached your last lesson of your course diploma in psychology. What an achievement! Today we will end off your course with personality disorders. We all think we know what a personality is. It is all the characteristic ways a person behaves and thinks. We tend to type people as behaving in one way in many situations. When personality characteristics interfere with relationships with others, cause a person distress, or in general disrupt activities of daily living, we consider these to be personality disorders. In this lesson, we will look at characteristic ways of behaving in relation to a number of specific personality disorders. First, we examine how we conceptualize personality disorders and the issues related to them. Then we describe the disorders themselves. By the end of today's lesson, you should be able to identify the 10 personality disorders outlined in the DSM-5. You should be able to understand the 3 main categories of personality disorders in the DSM-5. Evaluate whether schizotypal personality disorder should be considered a mild form of schizophrenia or not. You should be able to describe the relationship between obsessive-compulsive disorder and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, and critically examine the symptom clusters of each personality disorder and deduce which personality disorder would be the hardest to treat. As you've heard, students, the title for today's lesson is Personality Disorders. Let's commence our lesson. I'd like to introduce you to the personality disorders as a whole before we get into the individual disorders themselves. Starting with the very basics, what is a personality disorder? A personality disorder is a persistent pattern of emotions, cognitions, and behavior that results in enduring emotional distress for the person affected and or for others, and may cause difficulties with work and relationships. The DSM-5 notes that having a personality disorder may distress the affected person. Individuals with personality disorders may not feel any subjective distress, however. Indeed, it may in fact be others who actually feel distress because of the actions of the person with the disorder. In certain cases, someone other than the person with the personality disorder must decide whether the disorder is causing significant functional impairment, because the affected person often cannot make such a judgment. What if a person's characteristic ways of thinking and behaving cause significant distress to the self or others? What if the person cannot change this way of relating to the world and is unhappy? We might consider this person to have a personality disorder. Unlike many of the disorders that we've already discussed, personality disorders are chronic. They do not come and go, but originate in childhood and continue throughout adulthood. Because these chronic problems affect personality, they pervade every aspect of a person's life. For example, if a woman is overly suspicious, a sign of a possible paranoid personality disorder, this trait will affect almost everything she does, including her employment, her relationships. She may not be able to sustain a lasting relationship if she cannot trust anyone, and even where she lives. For example, she may move from one house to another, often if she suspects her landlords are out to get her. Although the prospects for treatment success for people who have personality disorders may be more optimistic than previously thought, unfortunately, many people who have personality disorders, in addition to other psychological problems, for example major depression, tend to do poorly in treatment. One factor important to the success or lack of success of treatment is how the therapist feels about the client. Therapists especially need to guard against letting their personal feelings interfere with treatment when working with people who have personality disorders. The DSM-5 lists 10 specific personality disorders. Prior to the DSM-5, clinicians would discuss personality disorders in the DSM-4 using the categorical system. the personality disorders were included on a separate axis, axis 2, because as a group they were seen as distinct. It was thought that the characteristic traits were more ingrained and inflexible in people who have personality disorders, and their disorders themselves were less likely to be successfully modified. With the changes made with the DSM-5, these separate axes were eliminated, and now the personality disorders are listed with the rest of the DSM-5 disorders. You may be surprised to learn that the category of personality disorders is controversial because it involves a number of unresolved issues. There is general contention around the categorical versus dimensional models. Examining these issues can help you understand all the disorders we will cover in this lesson. Let's explore the categorical and dimensional models a bit to try and understand why there is contention around them. Most of us are sometimes suspicious of others and a little paranoid, overly dramatic, too self-involved or reclusive. Fortunately, these characteristics do not last long or are not overly intense. They have not significantly impaired how we live and work. People with personality disorders, however, display problem characteristics over extended periods and in many situations, which can cause great emotional pain for themselves, for others, or both.
No.
Their difficulty can be seen as one of degree
Listen to
rather
my
than
psychology
kind.
lesson.
In other words, the problems of people with personality disorders may just be extreme versions of the problems many of us experience temporarily, such as being shy or suspicious. The distinction between problems of degree and problems of kind is usually described in terms of dimensions, which refers to degree, instead of categories, which refers to kind. The issue that continues to be debated in the field is whether personality disorders are extreme versions of otherwise typical personality variations, or ways of relating that are completely different from psychologically healthy behavior. Many researchers and clinicians in this field see personality disorders as extremes on one or more personality dimensions. Because of the way people are diagnosed with the DSM-5, the personality disorders, like most other disorders, end up being viewed in categories. There are advantages to using categorical models of behavior, the most important being their convenience. With simplification, however, problems arise. One is that the mere act of using categories leads clinicians to reify the disorders. That is, to view disorders as real things, comparable to the realness of an infection or a broken arm. Some argue that personality disorders are not things that exist, but points at which society decides a particular way of relating to the world has become a problem. There is the important unresolved issue again. Are personality disorders just an extreme variant of normal personality, or are they distinctly different disorders? According to Whittaker, some have proposed that the DSM-5 personality disorders section be replaced or at least supplemented by a dimensional model in which individuals would not only be given categorical diagnoses, but would also be rated on a series of personality dimensions. What do you think? To some it may sound like a great middle ground, but is it realistic? Can you think of any advantages of this solution? Well, Whittaker has argued for decades that such a system would have at least 3 advantages over a purely categorical system. Firstly, it would retain more information about each individual. Secondly, it would be more flexible because it would permit both categorical and dimensional differentiations among individuals. And thirdly, it would avoid the often arbitrary decisions involved in assigning a person to a diagnostic category. Currently, there is an alternative model of personality disorders included in the section on emerging measures and models in the DSM-5 that is included for further study. The DSM-5 divides the personality disorders into 3 groups or clusters. This will probably continue until a strong scientific basis is established for viewing them differently. The cluster division is based on resemblance. Let me introduce you to each of these clusters and the personality disorders under each cluster. Cluster A is called the odd or eccentric cluster. It includes paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders. Cluster B is the dramatic, emotional, or erratic cluster. It consists of antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders. Cluster C is the anxious or fearful cluster. It includes avoidant, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders. Let's dive in by into detail about each cluster. This next core topic is dedicated to Cluster A, the odd or eccentric personality disorders. Let us look at them. Let us start with paranoid personality disorder and odd or eccentric personality disorder. People with paranoid personality disorder are excessively mistrustful and suspicious of others without any justification. They assume other people are out to harm or trick them. Therefore, they tend not to confide in others. Although it is probably adaptive to be a little wary of other people and their motives, being too distrustful can interfere with making friends, working with others, and in general, getting through daily interactions in a functional way. For example, these people would view a neighbor's barking dog or a delayed airline flight as a deliberate attempt to annoy them. Unfortunately, such mistrust often extends to people close to them and makes meaningful relationships difficult. You can have a look at the case vignette in this lesson's summary notes to see what I mean and to understand this disorder better. Many of the disorders we will be discussing in this lesson have accompanying case vignettes in the summary notes. Imagine what a lonely existence paranoid personality disorder must be. Suspiciousness and mistrust can show themselves in a number of ways. People with paranoid personality disorder may be argumentative, they may complain, or they may be quiet. This style of interaction is communicated sometimes non-verbally to others, often resulting in discomfort among those who come in contact with them because of this volatility. These individuals are sensitive to criticism and have an excessive need for autonomy. Having this disorder increases the risk of suicide attempts and violent behavior, and these people tend to have a poor overall quality of life. A clinician who's considering a diagnosis for paranoid personality disorder has to consider 4 or more symptoms as listed in the DSM-5. Let's have a look at these. Criterion A states that there should be a pervasive distrust and suspiciousness of others, such that their motives are interpreted as malevolent, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts. This is indicated by 4 or more of the symptoms that follow. The individual suspects without sufficient evidence that others are exploiting, harming, or deceiving him or her. They are preoccupied with unjustified doubts about their loyalty or trustworthiness of friends or associates. They are reluctant to confide in others because of unwarranted fear that the information will be used maliciously against them. They would read hidden demeaning or threatening meanings into benign remarks or events, such as the dog barking example I mentioned earlier. The individual persistently bears grudges. For example, he or she is unforgiving of insults, injuries, or slights. The individual perceives attacks on his or her character or reputation that are not apparent to others and is quick to react angrily or to counterattack. Lastly, they have recurrent suspicions without justifications regarding fidelity of their spouse or sexual partner. And criterion B states that the symptoms do not occur exclusively during the course of schizophrenia, a bipolar disorder or depressive disorder with psychotic features, or another psychotic disorder, and is not attributable to the physiological effects of another medical condition. But what if the criteria for paranoid personality disorder are met before the onset of schizophrenia? Surely then, one can't completely disregard the diagnosis of paranoid personality disorder just because of the onset of schizophrenia. Well, what a clinician would do is add the word pre-morbid to the diagnosis. For example, paranoid personality disorder, pre-morbid. Now let's move on to the next personality disorder in Cluster A, schizoid personality disorder. Do you know someone who is a loner? Someone who would choose a solitary walk over an invitation to a party? A person who comes to class alone, sits alone, and always leaves alone. Now magnify this presence for isolation many times over, and you can begin to grasp the impact of schizoid personality disorder. People with this personality disorder show a pattern of detachment from social relationships and a limited range of emotions in interpersonal situations. They seem aloof, cold, and indifferent to other people. The term schizoid is relatively old, having been used by Bleuler in 1924 to describe people who tend to turn inward and away from the outside world. These people were said to lack emotional expressiveness and pursued vague interests. Individuals with schizoid personality disorder seem neither to desire nor to enjoy closeness with others, including romantic or sexual relationships. As a result, they appear cold and detached and do not seem affected by praise or criticism. One of the changes in the DSM-4 from previous versions was the recognition that at least some people with schizoid personality disorder are sensitive to the opinions of others, but are unwilling or unable to express this emotion. For them, social isolation may be extremely painful. Unfortunately, homelessness appears to be prevalent among people with this personality disorder, perhaps as a result of their lack of close friendships and lack of dissatisfaction about not having a sexual relationship with another person. The social deficiencies of people with schizoid personality disorder are similar to those of people with paranoid personality disorder, although they are more extreme. Both involve social isolation and poor rapport. However, the core difference is that those with paranoid personality disorder present ideas of reference, which are false beliefs that benign or meaningless events relate just to them. And those with schizoid personality disorder present constricted affect, in other words, limited emotions. Of course, as with many disorders, the symptoms are essentially a spectrum as they may overlap, but this is just the core difference. The clinician who is considering a diagnosis for schizoid personality disorder has to consider 4 or more symptoms as listed in the DSM-5. Let us go through them. Criterion A states that there should be a pervasive pattern of detachment from social relationships and a restricted range of expression of emotions in interpersonal settings, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts. This is indicated by 4 or more of the following symptoms. The individual neither desires nor enjoys close relationships, including being part of a family. They almost always choose solitary activities. The person has little, if any, interest in having sexual experiences with another person. The person takes pleasure in few, if any, activities. They lack close friends or confidants other than first-degree relatives. They appear indifferent to the praise or criticism of others, and they show emotional coldness, detachment, or flattened affectivity. And similarly to paranoid personality disorder, criterion B states that the symptoms do not occur exclusively during the course of schizophrenia, a bipolar disorder, or depressive disorder with psychotic features, another psychotic disorder, or autism spectrum disorder, and is not attributable to the physiological effects of another medical condition. The last personality disorder that falls under the cluster A, the odd or eccentric type, is schizotypal personality disorder. People with schizotypal personality disorder are typically socially isolated, like those with schizoid personality disorder. In addition, they also behave in ways that would seem unusual or odd to many of us, and they tend to be suspicious and to have odd beliefs. Schizotypal personality disorder is considered by some to be on a continuum, that is on the same spectrum with schizophrenia, but without some of the more debilitating symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions. In fact, because of this close connection, the DSM-5 includes this disorder under both the heading of a personality disorder and under the heading of a schizophrenia spectrum disorder. People given a diagnosis of schizotypal personality disorder have psychotic-like, but not psychotic symptoms, such as believing everything else relates to them personally, social deficits, and sometimes cognitive impairments or paranoia. These individuals are often considered odd or bizarre because of how they relate to other people. how they think and behave, and even how they dress. Remember when I said that those with schizotypal personality disorder believe that everything relates to them personally? Do you remember what we call that belief? I briefly touched on it earlier in this lesson. It's called ideas of reference. Someone with ideas of reference may believe that somehow everyone on a passing city bus is talking about them, yet they may be able to acknowledge this is unlikely. Note that those with schizophrenia also experience this, but they can't see the illogic of the ideas as those with schizotypal personality disorder can. Individuals with schizotypal personality disorder also have odd beliefs or engage in magical thinking, believing, for example, that they are clairvoyant or telepathic. In addition, they report unusual perceptual experiences, including such illusions as feeling the presence of another person when they are alone. Because persons with schizotypal personality disorder often have beliefs around religious or spiritual themes, clinicians must be aware that different cultural beliefs or practices may lead to a mistaken diagnosis of this disorder. Clinicians have to be particularly sensitive to cultural practices that may differ from their own and can distort their view of certain seemingly unusual behaviors. Let's have a look at the diagnostic criteria for schizotypal personality disorder. Criterion A states that there should be a pervasive pattern of social and interpersonal deficits marked by acute discomfort with and reduced capacity for close relationships, as well as by cognitive or perceptual distortions and eccentricities of behavior, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts. These are indicated by 5 or more of the following 9 symptoms. 1. Ideas of reference, excluding delusions of reference. Odd beliefs or magical thinking that influences behavior and is inconsistent with subcultural norms, for example, superstitiousness, beliefs in clairvoyance, telepathy, or a sixth sense. In children and adolescents, these may present as bizarre fantasies or preoccupations. Unusual perceptual experiences, including bodily illusions. Odd thinking and speech, for example, vague, circumstantial, metaphorical, over-elaborate or stereotyped thinking and speech. Suspiciousness or paranoid ideation. Number 6 includes inappropriate or constricted affect, behavior or appearance that is odd, eccentric, or peculiar. A lack of close friends or confidants other than first-degree relatives, and excessive social anxiety that does not diminish with familiarity and tends to be associated with paranoid fears rather than negative judgments about the self. And criterion B states that these symptoms do not occur exclusively during the course of schizophrenia, a bipolar disorder, or depressive disorder with psychotic features, another psychotic disorder, or autism spectrum disorder. What do you think the clinician would do if the criteria for this disorder are met prior to the onset of schizophrenia? Well, as with paranoid personality disorder, the clinician would add premorbid to the diagnosis. For example, schizoid personality disorder, premorbid. And now we can move on to our cluster B personality disorders. These are the dramatic, emotional, or erratic disorders. The first disorder we will discuss in cluster B includes antisocial personality disorder. Individuals with antisocial personality disorder are among the most puzzling of individuals and are characterized as having a history of failing to comply with social norms. They perform actions most of us would find unacceptable, such as stealing from friends and family. They also tend to be irresponsible, impulsive, and deceitful. Individuals with antisocial personality disorder tend to have long histories of violating the rights of others. They are often described as being aggressive because they take what they want, indifferent to the concerns of other people. Frequent lying and cheating seem to be second nature to them, and often they appear unable to distinguish between the truth and the lies they make up to further their own goals. They show no remorse or concern over the sometimes devastating effects of their actions. Substance abuse is common in people with antisocial personality disorder and appears to be a lifelong pattern among these individuals. The long-term outcome for people with antisocial personality disorder is usually poor, regardless of their gender. Let's go over the diagnostic criteria for this disorder. Criterion A states that the person must display a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others, occurring since the age of 15 years. This is indicated by 3 or more of the following symptoms. Failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors as indicated by repeatedly performing acts that are ground for arrest. Deceitfulness as indicated by repeated lying, use of aliases, or conning others for personal profit or pleasure. Impulsivity or failure to plan ahead. Irritability and aggressiveness as indicated by repeated physical fights or assaults. Reckless disregard for safety of self or others. Consistent irresponsibility as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honoring financial obligations. A lack of remorse as indicated by being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another. Criterion B states that the individual is at least 18 years. Criterion C states that there is evidence of conduct disorder with onset before the age of 15 years. And as for Criterion D, the occurrence of antisocial behavior is not exclusive during the course of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. The next personality disorder under Cluster B is borderline personality disorder. Let's peruse borderline personality disorder. People with borderline personality disorder lead tumultuous lives. Their moods and relationships are unstable, and usually they have a poor self-image. These people often feel empty and are at great risk of dying by their own hands, that is, to commit suicide. People with borderline personality disorder tend to have turbulent relationships, fearing abandonment, but lacking control over their emotions. They often engage in behaviors that are suicidal, self-mutilative, or both, cutting, burning, or punching themselves. People with this personality disorder are often intense, going from anger to deep depression in a short time. Dysfunction in the area of emotion is sometimes considered one of the core features of borderline personality disorder and is one of the best predictors of suicide in this group. The characteristic of instability in emotion, interpersonal relationships, self-concept, and behavior is seen as a core feature, with some describing this group as being stably unstable. This instability extends to impulsivity, which can be seen in their drug abuse and self-mutilation. Although not so obvious as to why, the self-injurious behaviors, such as cutting, sometimes as described as tension-reducing by people who engage in these behaviors. A feeling of emptiness almost always present and a core feature of this disorder. These people are also sometimes described as chronically bored and have difficulties with their own identities. Borderline personality disorder is one of the most common personality disorders observed in clinical settings. It is observed in every culture and is seen in about 1% to 2% of the general population. Fortunately, the long-term outcome for people with borderline personality disorder is encouraging. Approximately 9 out of 10 patients with borderline personality disorder achieve remission in the decade after seeking treatment. Let's have a look at the diagnostic criteria. As mentioned before, the core feature of borderline personality disorder is instability. So there should be a pervasive pattern of instability of interpersonal relationships, self-image and affects, and marked impulsivity, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts. This is indicated by 5 or more of the following. Frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Please note, this does not include suicidal or self-mutilating behavior covered in Criterion 5. A pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. Identity disturbance, markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, for example, excessive spending, excessive sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, and binge eating. Recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats, or self-mutilating behavior. Affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood, for example, intense episodic dysphoria, irritability, or anxiety, usually lasting a few hours and only rarely more than a few days. Chronic feelings of emptiness. Inappropriate intense anger or difficulty controlling anger, such as frequent displays of temper, constant anger, or recurrent physical fights. And transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. And now it is time for the next disorder that falls under the Cluster B personality disorders, histrionic personality disorder. Individuals with histrionic personality disorder tend to be overly dramatic and often seem almost to be acting, which is why the term histrionic, which means theatrical in manner, is used. People with histrionic personality disorder are inclined to express their emotions in an exaggerated fashion. For example, hugging someone they have just met or crying uncontrollably during a sad movie. They also tend to be vain, self-centered, and uncomfortable when they are not in the limelight. They are often seductive in appearance and behavior, and they are typically concerned about their looks. In addition, they seek reassurance and approval constantly and may become upset or angry when others do not attend to them or praise them. People with histrionic personality disorder also tend to be impulsive and have great difficulty delaying gratification. The cognitive style associated with histrionic personality disorder is impressionistic, characterized by a tendency to view situations in global, black and white terms. Speech is often vague, lacking in detail, and characterized by exaggeration. The higher rate of this diagnosis among women versus men raises questions about the nature of the disorder and its diagnostic criteria. There is some thought that the features of histrionic personality disorder, such as overdramatization, vanity, seductiveness, and over-concern with physical appearance, are characteristic of the Western stereotypical female and may lead to an overdiagnosis among women. Let's discuss the diagnostic criteria for histrionic personality disorder. The individual will display a pervasive pattern of excessive emotionality and attention-seeking, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts. These features are characterized by 5 or more of the following. The individual is uncomfortable in situations in which he or she is not the center of attention. Interaction with others is often characterized by inappropriate, sexually seductive or provocative behavior. Displays rapidly shifting and shallow expression of emotions. Consistently uses physical appearance to draw attention to self. Has a style of speech that is excessively impressionistic and lacking in detail. Shows self-dramatization, theatricality, and exaggerated expression of emotion. Is suggestible, for example, easily influenced by others or circumstances. Considers relationships to be more intimate than they actually are. The next disorder is narcissistic personality disorder. Let's discuss it. We all know people who think highly of themselves, perhaps exaggerating their real abilities. They consider themselves somehow different from others and deserving of special treatment. In narcissistic personality disorder, this tendency is taken to its extreme. In Greek mythology, Narcissus was a youth who spurned the love of Echo. So enamored was he of his own beauty, he spent his days admiring his own image reflected in a pool of water. Psychoanalysts, including Freud, used the term narcissistic to describe people who showed an exaggerated sense of self-importance and are preoccupied with receiving attention. People with narcissistic personality disorder have an unreasonable sense of self-importance and are so preoccupied with themselves that they lack sensitivity and compassion for other people. They are not comfortable unless someone is admiring them. Their exaggerated feelings and their fantasies of greatness, called grandiosity, create a number of negative attributes. They require and expect a great deal of special attention. The best table in the restaurant, the illegal parking space in front of the movie theater, for example. They also tend to use or exploit others for their own interests and to show little empathy. When confronted with other successful people, they can be extremely envious and arrogant, and because they often fail to live up to their own expectations, they are often depressed. As per the diagnostic criteria, there must be a pervasive pattern of grandiosity in fantasy or behavior, a need for admiration and lack of empathy, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts. These features must be indicated by 5 or more of the following. The individual has a grandiose sense of self-importance. For example, he or she exaggerates achievements and talents and expects to be recognized as superior without commensurate achievements. They are preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. They believe they are special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high-status people or institutions. They request excessive admiration. They have a sense of entitlement. For example, unreasonable expectations of especially favorable treatment or automatic compliance with his or her expectations. The individual is interpersonally exploitative. For example, takes advantage of others to achieve his or her own ends. The individual lacks empathy, is unwilling to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others. They are often envious of others or believes that others are envious of him or her. They show arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes. Now we can peruse the final cluster of personality disorders, Cluster C, anxious or fearful disorders. The first disorder in this cluster is avoidant personality disorder. As the name suggests, people with avoidant personality disorder are extremely sensitive to the opinions of others, and although they desire social relationships, their anxiety leads them to avoid such associations. Their extremely low self-esteem, coupled with the fear of rejection, causes them to be limited in their friendships and dependent on those they feel comfortable with. These individuals feel chronically rejected by others and are pessimistic about their futures. Theodore Millon in 1981, who initially proposed this diagnosis, notes that it is important to distinguish between individuals who are asocial because they are apathetic, affectively flat, and relatively uninterested in interpersonal relationships, and individuals who are asocial because they are interpersonally anxious and fearful of rejection. It is the latter who fit the criteria of avoidant personality disorder. According to the DSM-5, the individual must display a pervasive pattern of social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to negative evaluation, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts. This must be indicated by 4 or more of the following symptoms. The individual avoids occupational activities that involve significant interpersonal contact because of fears of criticism, disapproval, or rejection. They are unwilling to get involved with people unless certain of being liked. They show restraint within intimate relationships because of the fear of being shamed or ridiculed. They are preoccupied with being criticized or rejected in social situations. They are inhibited in new interpersonal situations because of feelings of inadequacy. They view themselves as socially inept, personally unappealing, or inferior to others. And lastly, they are unusually reluctant to take personal risks or to engage in any new activities because they may prove embarrassing. The next disorder in this cluster is dependent personality disorder. Let us peruse that. We all know what it means to be dependent on another person. People with dependent personality disorder, however, rely on others to make ordinary decisions, as well as important ones, which results in an unreasonable fear of abandonment. Individuals with dependent personality disorder sometimes agree with other people when their own opinion differs, so as not to be rejected. Their desire to obtain and maintain supportive and nurturing relationships may lead to their other behavioral characteristics, including submissiveness, timidity, and passivity. It is important to note that in certain cultures, such as East Asian Confucianism, dependence and submission may be viewed as a desired interpersonal state. I want to make sure that you understand the difference between avoidant and dependent personality disorders. People with dependent personality disorder are similar to those with avoidant personality disorder in their feelings of inadequacy, sensitivity to criticism, and need for reassurance. However, people with avoidant personality disorder respond to these feelings by avoiding relationships, whereas those with dependent personality disorder respond to clinging to relationships. These are the diagnostic criteria one would consider when diagnosing someone with this disorder. The individual would have to display a pervasive and excessive need to be taken care of that leads to submissive and clingy behavior and fears of separation, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts. This is indicated by 5 or more of the following. The individual has difficulty making everyday decisions without an excessive amount of advice and reassurance from others. They need others to assume responsibility for most major areas of his or her life. They have difficulty expressing disagreement with others because of fear of support or approval. They have difficulty initiating projects or doing things on their own because of a lack of self-confidence in judgment or abilities rather than a lack of motivation or energy. They go to excessive lengths to obtain nurturance and support from others, to the point of volunteering to do things that are unpleasant. They feel uncomfortable or helpless when alone because of exaggerated fears of being unable to take care of himself or herself. They urgently seek another relationship as a source of care and support when a close relationship ends. They are unrealistically preoccupied with fears of being left to take care of himself or herself. And now for our very last disorder for this lesson, obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. People who have obsessive-compulsive personality disorder are characterized by fixation on things being done the right way. Although many might envy their persistence and dedication, this preoccupation with details prevents them from completing much of anything. Someone with this disorder is work-oriented, spending little time doing anything that isn't related to work. Because of their general rigidity, these people tend to have poor interpersonal relationships. Although the names are similar, this personality disorder seems to be only distantly related to obsessive-compulsive disorder. Someone with obsessive-compulsive disorder tends to have obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors, whereas those with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder don't tend to experience obsessive thoughts or compulsive behaviors. You've already learned that OCD is an anxiety disorder, and you know that obsessive-compulsive personality disorder is a personality disorder. People with OCD sometimes show characteristics of the personality disorder, but they show the characteristics of other personality disorders as well. For example, avoidant, histrionic, or dependent personality disorders. Let's have a look at the diagnostic criteria. The individual must display a pervasive pattern of preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and mental and interpersonal control at the expense of flexibility, openness, and efficiency, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts. This must be indicated by 4 or more of the following. They are preoccupied with details, rules, lists, order, organization, or schedules to the extent that the major point of the activity is lost. They show perfectionism that interferes with task completion. For example, they are unable to complete a project because of his or her overly strict standards are not met. They are excessively devoted to work and productivity to the exclusion of leisure activities and friendships not accounted for by obvious economic necessity. They are over-conscientious, scrupulous, and inflexible about matters of morality, ethics, or values not accounted for by cultural or religious identification. They are unable to discard worn-out or worthless objects, even when they have no sentimental value for them. They are reluctant to delegate tasks or to work with others unless they submit to exactly his or her way of doing things. They adopt a miserly spending style toward both self and others. Money is viewed as something to be hoarded for future catastrophes. And lastly, they show rigidity and stubbornness. And that brings us to the end of the final lesson of this course. And with that, you have now unlocked your lesson assignment number 4 for Module 4 for your course diploma in psychology. This lesson will help you prepare for your final module assignment. Students, as you know, You will now also complete your final module assignment for Module 4. Upon successful completion of your module assignment, you will obtain your professional diploma in psychology. What a wonderful achievement! Congratulations, students! You have now completed this course. I hope you enjoyed the journey with me and that you've learned a lot. This course has not always been easy, and I've tried to present it in as simple a way as possible, which was not always an easy task.